Welcome to the Unlist. This is episode 49, and if you're watching this, you probably watched the previous two episodes, which were basically two halves of a larger episode that I had to break into two because of the topic. The topic being Avon, and Avon is a very old house with a very long history, very complex history, and they probably have more fragrances than any other Western perfume brand on the planet. Like I said in those episodes, somewhere to the tune of like 800 known fragrances. They have so many releases that not actually all of them are known. Not all of them are cataloged on Fragrantica or Parfumo or Base Notes. So there could be some Avon fragrances out there that people don't even know about because they're not listed online anywhere. And then when you couple that with the fact that they might take the same fragrance and give it 3 different names in 3 different territories in the world, they localize effectively their fragrances for the target market, release some fragrances in some markets but not in others, etc., etc., etc. It creates a mess. So this video is not a part 3 of that double video. I said what I needed to say about the house, about its history, about how it was sold and bought, about the relative quality of the perfumes and how they can get away with that quality for the price, what to expect from their fragrances, both vintage and more recent. I said in those episodes I would also do continued Avon-related content, but more specific to my favorite fragrances, other more tangent-based things about Avon, like how they have in recent years sort of fallen from grace. So I figured this episode, I would tackle the latter of the two. I would talk about what really happened to the brand. That's not information that is really relevant to making an episode about the brand and about the brand's perfumes. Knowing their fate is kind of extracurricular. It's like when you talk about Chanel. You want to know what Chanel is all about, what their fragrances are about. You're not necessarily too concerned about where they may be heading in the future, right? You want to know where they are right now. You want to know what's available, et cetera, et cetera. You want to know how they got to that point, so on and so forth. And that's what I kind of did with the two-parter for Avon, as I discussed how they came into be and all that stuff, what they're about, what to expect, where to find their stuff if you're interested, yada, yada, yada. Their strengths and their weaknesses, you know, stuff like that. So this episode is basically going to deal with not only the decline of Avon, but the decline of value fragrance brands in general. So that's why it's not a part 3 to the other 2 episodes. It's not directly about Avon all the time. It's generally about the mail order brands, the drugstore, brick and mortar value brands. What has happened to them? And more or less a bit of Nostradamus prediction of where the market's going. So the episode is going to be about Avon at least half the time, but then half the time we're going to be talking about other brands in the same price range as well. So let's get going here. So what happened to Avon? What happened to Revlon? What happened to Elizabeth Arden? What happened to Swank? What happened to MEM, to Schulten, to Charles of the Ritz, to Prince Machiavelli, to Lentherique, to Bourgeois? What happened to all of these value brands that we had? You know, the makers of Evening in Paris and British Sterling, Fabergé, Brut, Old Spice, okay? What happened to all these brands? These brands that a lot of vintage enthusiasts sometimes, you know, maybe they don't put them on the same pedestal they put vintage Dior's on or vintage Hermes fragrances on. Definitely not vintage Guerlain fragrances, but you know, if you're someone who respects classic Coty fragrances, then you're someone who probably would also respect classic Avon fragrances, classic Revlon fragrances. So what happened? There was a lot of good stuff in there, and now it's all, most of it is all gone, all discontinued. And what little bit of it does exist is in a form that's almost unrecognizable, you know, smell-wise. Like some of the worst reformulations in the world are drugstore fragrances, unfortunately, and a lot of that has to do with the profit margins and the sales, right? They just don't sell like they used to. So the main concern is not fidelity really to the original formula or fidelity to what the fragrance was. The concern for the ones that even still exist is just make it as cheap as humanly possible and not make it unwearable. Even though it could be borderline unwearable, it could be near intolerable, but it can't quite cross that line, right? So, well, I'll tell you what happened. And it's not a story that some of you, depending on your position in the socioeconomic rat race, your station in society, or your political affiliation, it's not a story you want to hear. It could be a politicized, a bit of a soapbox thing. And if you disagree with me, or you think I'm in a certain lot or whatever and deserves the persecution that you would enact upon me if you could, then I'm sorry. You can unfollow me and go away. I don't care. I don't need your subscription. I don't make money anyway. But I'm not going to sugarcoat this, all right? What happened to drugstore fragrances? What happened to Avon? What happened to a lot of these value brands is really just simple economics. It's the vast majority of us got more and more poor, and a smaller subsection of us got more and more rich. And perfume, like jewelry, like high fashion, like a lot of things, like tobacco, like liquor, they are what? They're luxuries. They're luxuries. Perfumes are luxuries. And typically, historically, luxuries are only afforded to the highest classes of any society where money and status play a role. So if you live in a completely egalitarian society like the ancient Greeks, or you live, on a commune somewhere and you worship a potato and all of you wear burlap sacks over your heads or something, then yeah, maybe everyone's exactly the same. None of that matters. But for most societies, there are haves and have-nots. There always have been. So the luxuries are usually enjoyed by the haves, correct? I think that's something that most of us can agree on, whether we're left or right or up or down or sideways, doesn't really matter. So perfume, right around the time of the Industrial Revolution going into full swing, perfume started becoming democratized. The original point of Avon, when it was the California Perfume Company, was to get more fragrances in the hands of more people who otherwise would never seek them out, which in this case we're talking upper middle class, not rich, but upper middle class homemakers living in urban areas. Their husbands had stable jobs and had money to spare, but they were stuck with the kids, stuck cleaning the house. They couldn't afford a nanny or a maid. They weren't, like I said, they weren't millionaire wives. If they were millionaire wives, if they were able to get in their little horse and buggy and go wherever they wanted because they had a midwife or they had, the help at home, yeah, they could shop to their heart's content wherever they wanted. But if you're that upper middle class, you have enough money to be comfortable, but not enough money to hire servants, so you got to clean and cook yourself. So that's where the California Perfume Company, aka Avon, made all their money, bringing the luxuries to their door. And then Coty kind of did the same thing, except Coty decided to put the stuff in physical retail, but put it in physical retail that was below the normal place you would find perfume. Typically, you only found perfume in boutiques, Guerlain boutique, Caron boutique. You found it in perfume, unaffiliated perfume boutiques, boutiques that sold multiple brands. You found it in ultra high-end department stores where only the rich could shop, places like Bergdorf Goodman and Harrods. Every old Tom, Dick, and Harry didn't go to Harrods, trust me. So the idea of the Coty fragrance was to bring that stuff down. So now you could sell the Coty stuff in your local general store, which would evolve into the pharmacy, the drugstore, right, the convenience store. And then, of course, that led to larger format places like Kmart and Ames, and then eventually Five and Dime, Walmart. You get the point, right? Target, more modern brands. But the big box discount stores, which effectively replaced the smaller general stores. But that's where these brands lived. If they weren't door-to-door like Avon, and Avon was followed, Avon was followed by brands like Armand Dupree in Mexico, or Jafra in Mexico. In Europe, they had Oriflame and Yves Rocher. Okay, America had a couple other brands too that were competing against Avon. There was Amway, who made perfumes. Mary Kay made perfumes as well. Those were all sold out of catalogs. So Avon wasn't like a monopoly. They didn't have the lockdown on this. They just started it. But if you weren't getting your perfumes door to door or through some mail order catalog, and you weren't made of money, you were getting them from one of these general stores, one of these pharmacies, etc. Okay, and that market, as middle class prosperity continued. There was a Great Depression that affected most of the Western world, not just America, and then of course 2 world wars, which did a lot of damage. But after all that smoke cleared and we headed into the mid-century, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, there was enough prosperity in most places, maybe not undeveloped countries, but there was the places where these brands were being sold, right? So United States, Canada, most of Western Europe, to a lesser extent, some places in Asia, but you get my point, right? Where these brands were being sold, the middle class was prosperous enough, and the income inequality was less enough that these luxury brands saw money on the table by selling to the middle classes, by selling to the working people, not just sticking to the managerial folks or the ruling classes or what have you not. They were going, okay, well, these people will buy our stuff too. So that just made that middle market explode. And that's where all these brands came from. Swank, Pfizer Leeming, I can name off dozens of them, and they're all gone. Every single one of them is gone. They're all gone. Jovan, of course. If you want your real sexy, musky fragrances, you got Jovan. But you get my point. All of these high street brands, as people in the UK would call them, all these high street brands, they were very populous. But there was a bit of a culling, though. And this culling started really in the 80s, okay? And this is where Avon comes back into the picture again, where we come back to Avon. So Avon was noticing that due to the proliferation of highways and shopping centers and indoor malls, it was now more and more convenient for people of the same income level that Avon typically served. It was more convenient for them to now hop in their car and go to the local Sears, the local JCPenney, hop in the car, go to the local mall. The main streets in the small towns were dying because the big mall sitting outside the main street was sucking all the business away. If you've ever seen Stranger Things, I'm talking about Starcourt Mall made downtown Hawkins almost go out of business. Okay, that was a picture-perfect representation of what was going on in the 80s. A lot of these middle America towns, and in some ways villages in Europe too, were getting siphoned off when bigger multinational businesses came to town. They could offer better selection, better prices, bring luxury a little closer to home. Now I feel like the culture in Europe is different. A lot of your high streets and your town squares survive over there because, cars and highways are less of a thing in Europe than they are. They have trains and whatnot. But at least in the United States, okay, the proliferation of these big suburban sprawl areas, they really damaged the appeal of these cheaper brands. People no longer wanted to go to the corner drugstore to buy that bottle of Evening in Paris, and no longer wanted to order from the Avon catalog anymore. They didn't have to. They could get in their car, go to the Macy's, and actually shop Dior and Chanel. Yeah, they were more expensive, right? They were more expensive. But if you knew it was right there in front of you, you might go, okay, well, you know what? I'll just hold on to my money. I'll save up. Or I'll buy a smaller bottle. I'll get a little rechargeable bottle of number 5 instead of a big 100 ml, okay? I won't buy the Parfum. I can't afford that. I'll get the cologne instead. You see, the higher end brands were releasing the lower concentrations and the smaller sizes because they knew they could capture that money from that middle income group, okay? But then, around the same time, and those of you who lived through the 80s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, around the same time, we saw the economy begin to globalize more, okay, thanks to, once again, the rise of technology. And of course, millionaires became multimillionaires, became billionaires, and they wanted to suck all the money up tax breaks across the board, so-called trickle-down economics, which didn't work. Of course, you could tell the way things are today, they didn't work. Clearly, they didn't work. But a lot of these jobs that these people had, these manufacturing jobs, these transportation jobs, service economy-based jobs, whatever they were, food processing, that was being broken down and shipped overseas to China or down to poorer countries like in South America, where the value of the dollar could be, or the pound or wherever country you're from, could be exploited against a weaker economy. So suddenly those folks weren't working in factories anymore. Now they were cashiers in grocery stores. They weren't in steel mills anymore. They were now at McDonald's. Their jobs were gone, and they didn't have the education or the access to education to go up, right? They couldn't move up the ladder. And since there was a vacuum being created in the middle, where did they go? They weren't able to go up, so they went down. And then I don't need to tell you about urban decay and deindustrialization and all the drugs and the crime and the gangs and all that stuff. That's not really a purview for this video, but it all goes hand in hand. And these people just weren't buying these fragrances. There was only two ways you could go here. You could go up market with your perfumes. You could get out of that drugstore segment and try and rebrand yourself as a more luxury brand. Get into Macy's again. If you exited Macy's to go down market because it was prosperous to do so, now you got to crawl back up into Macy's or crawl back up into JCPenney, Nordstrom, or whatever. Some brands managed to do that, Elizabeth Arden, a lot of your classic drugstore brands, Estee Lauder, Elizabeth Arden, they were successful at moving back up market, becoming expensive, becoming exclusive, okay? So a lot of brands like Schulten, like MEM, like Leeming couldn't. So they eventually hit rock bottom, and they were bought and sold by pharmaceutical brands like Procter & Gamble. Schulten was sold to P&G. MEM and Dana ended up being bought by entrepreneurs who had New Renaissance Cosmetics, who would eventually create New Dana, who would eventually become Dana Classic. That whole merger, buying up all these dying drugstore brands and consolidating them under a new corporate umbrella. Coty would discontinue a lot of their stuff, and with all their stuff being discontinued, they would start focusing on creating higher market brands for designer licensees. So they would pick up licenses from Calvin Klein, and they have Gucci currently. You see where this is going, right? So they did what they had to do to survive. Avon, on the other hand, Avon just went, well, they tried going up market. I will say this, they did briefly try going up market. In the 80s, they did collaborations with designers. They did collaborations with celebrities. They tried going up market to a certain degree. Didn't really work for them. So what they had to do was they had to focus on what was still making them money, which was the cosmetics. They were still selling lots of makeup, lots of lipstick, lots of skincare. And that's why they busted their perfume out to the oil houses. They shut down internal development, shut down their labs, let go all their perfumers, and they began contracting out to IFF, Firmenich, and all those guys. Now fast forward into the 21st century, fast forward into the beginning of the 2000s, and Avon had a new CEO, the first woman CEO, which you'd think for a company that focuses so much on women, they would have had a woman CEO before 2000, but it took until 2000 for them to get a female CEO, and they got a woman by the name of Andrea Jung, who was a former Nordstrom, actually, executive. She left Nordstrom to helm Avon, and what she decided to do, she thought the means to success was rapid expansion. She thought, take all the money that we still have and reinvest it into our business and expand our selection of products and services, both up market and down, and just give more to offer to everyone. She also thought that Avon needed to have brick and mortar retail locations, so she actually put Avon in a lot of physical formats. Before there was Sephora and JCPenney, there was the Avon Mark store. Those of you who remember the Avon Mark store, you might know that they sold designer fragrances just like Sephora did, designer fragrances and other stuff, but then they had a selection of Avon fragrances that you could actually buy at the counter. Every so often when you go on eBay, you will see a bottle of Avon circa 2000, 2005, and it has a barcode on it. And you might go, why does this Avon box have a barcode on it? Because they don't sell at POS systems, but they did. Briefly, they did. So if you see an Avon fragrance made in that 5-year span or so with a barcode on it, you're seeing a remnant of retail inventory, Avon fragrance. I have a couple, so I know. And then, of course, they also tried to do the thing where they reignited their interest in collabing with celebrities and collabing with brands. So you had Ungaro fragrances. You had fragrances made for Bon Jovi and Derek Jeter and Patrick Dempsey. And there's just so many of them, okay? Tons of them. All right, so different designer collabs and celebrity collabs. They also greatly expanded their men's offerings. They actually spun off a separate men's division. They already had one back in the 60s, but they shuttered it in the 80s. They reopened the men's division and had a bunch of Avon for men skincare and Avon for men fragrances. So much stuff it makes your head spin, actually. But they burned through all that money, and all of that red ink that they burned through ultimately expedited their demise. And that's why Avon left the American market in 2014, became a UK-based company, and then eventually got sold to a Brazilian company, and now they're a Brazil-based company. They still sell products in the US, and they still sell them in the UK, but their focus is where their audience still is. And clearly it's not in the US anymore. It's not even in Europe anymore for the most part. They left France, they left Australia. It's primarily in developing countries. And the reason is, I don't need to tell you, but we don't live in a very high trust society like we did 120, 130 years ago. Would you let a stranger in your house to sell you perfume? Would you? Probably not, right? No, you're not going to let somebody in your house. That person could pull a gun on you, right? You don't know these days. People are crazy. We live in a very low trust society, so door-to-door solicitation is not really a thing. Not anymore. Not in today's world, no. And, you know, online shopping, yeah, you can sell Avon online, and people do try selling Avon online. I see plenty of eBay stores and Etsy and Mercari booth set up for Avon, but it's, at that point, you're just fishing. You're just throwing a line out there hoping you catch something. So, but as for the rest of the drugstore brands, they consolidated, they went out of business, they ceased to exist. And then designer brands, which had been expanding, you know, in the 70s and 80s anyway, designers kind of grew down to fill the void left by the drugstore brands. And nowadays, you know how our society is. Income inequality has gotten even worse. You have people with housing precarity, people with food precarity. You've got folks that make good money that have to live 3 and 4 to a single 2-bedroom apartment because they can't afford rent on their own. We live in a very messed up day right now. You've got people living like high hogs, you know, while folks who 30 or 40 years ago could afford to live on their own are now basically huddled together like paupers. That's the society we live in now. And that's not a society where you can really sell cheap perfume, is it? No. It's not really, you know. And you see some things, you know, I mean, there's stuff in Zara. You see some things, a couple of things left in Walmart and Target. Not all the drugstore brands are gone. They're not all gone, but most of them are. These days, if you're the kind of person who is just barely making enough money to pay all of your basic needs and whatever you have left, you're not thinking about perfume. And if you are, it's probably going to be a body spray. It's going to be Tag. It's going to be Lynx. It's going to be Body Fantasies, one of those. Or you're just going to use a really nice scented body wash or shampoo or something. So that's it, guys. That is my explanation to you. What happened to Avon? What happened to a lot of drugstore fragrances? It's not a pretty video, but at least you have an idea of what's up now. And thanks for watching the On List.